What's up, everyone? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master the second reading comprehension passage from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already taken that test, follow the link in the description below, try it first on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. And feel free to use the timestamps below to jump in between questions. We start by going through the passage itself, and then, for each question, we go over the question first and talk about what to look for in the answer choices, then we go over each individual answer choice. Let's take a look at passage number 2 from the May 2020 Flex LSAT. This was a fairly simple passage, I think a little easier than the first passage, in fact, probably the easiest of these 4 on this test, and the questions were also pretty straightforward. So let's dive in. We're just going to spend a couple minutes summing up each paragraph, kind of reading through the passage first before we get to the questions. So basically, paragraph 1 introduces these two characters, the trickster, right, a comic figure from Native American stories who has mortal weaknesses and supernatural powers, and the picaro. The picaro is the character in the picaresque novel, the central character, right? They're both heroes of episodic adventures, and they both live on the peripheries of society and have moral flaws. And recently, critics have used the term trickster, in fact, to refer to the picaro. We've sort of co-opted that term and used it to refer to the picaro. So they have these similarities, right? They're both morally flawed characters in the midst of these two different traditions of writing. So paragraph 1 just introduces us to these two characters. Paragraph 2 says, however, despite the critics in paragraph 1 who kind of compare them and assume that they're roughly the same thing, closer examination, according to paragraph 2, reveals that no, if you call them both a trickster, you're obscuring essential differences between them, that there are fundamental differences between them. And then this paragraph explains the picaro. The picaro, typically a male character, operates as an agent of satire to make fun of humans, to make fun of society. Most commonly, the adventures begin when he spontaneously yields to his own roguish impulses, right? He satisfies his own desires, he gives in to them, and indulges in vices and follies with relish and freedom. Other members of society are outraged by that, but they secretly indulge in those same things. And so therefore the picaro's authenticity serves as a foil to the perceived hypocrisy of society, right? Because they're doing all those same things. They're just not doing it out in the open like the picaro is. To such a society, the picaro can be dangerous, disruptive, and they therefore marginalize him. They sort of marginalize him from society because of that danger. It's in that distance that the satire occurs, that distance between the freedom of the picaro and the hypocrisy of the social being, that this satire occurs. So that's the picaro. That's paragraph 2. Then in the next 2 paragraphs, we say, but the trickster is different. The trickster was not meant to satirize anything, right? The trickster is usually an animal acting as a human agent, does not serve this satire function, right? Because the picaresque novel, which we just read about in the last paragraph, that takes place in and satirizes human society, but the trickster operates in the ahistorical world of myth, right? And whereas the targets of the picaresque novel are idiosyncrasies of human society, the trickster stories seek to instruct listeners about moral behavior of individuals using the trickster's negative example. So as opposed to the picaresque novel where we're making fun of society, the hypocrisies of society, in the case of the trickster in the Native American story, we're not doing that. We're actually using the trickster to try to provide a negative example to instruct people to not act like the trickster, right? In fact, whatever flaws the trickster reveals are thoroughly the trickster's own flaws. They're not a foil to a corrupt society. They're actually essential to who the trickster is. So it's not that the trickster is making fun of or representing the flaws of society. It's just who the trickster is, and the trickster is acting that way to instruct the reader to not act that way, right? The trickster is a comic figure precisely because of these irrational actions. And similarly, it's also a socially peripheral character, just like the picaro, just like we read about in the last paragraph, but not by being forced to the periphery by a hypocritical society, but rather because the trickster's flawed character makes the trickster antisocial, all the while helping listeners to avoid the flaws, avoid the mistakes that the trickster is committing. So basically, these last 2 paragraphs just highlight that there's this fundamental difference between the trickster and the Picaro, even though they are superficially similar, they're very different in that the trickster is not meant to make fun of society. The trickster is meant to create a negative example to tell you what not to act like from a moral perspective. Whereas the Picaro is meant to actually make society look bad, to highlight the hypocrisy and to satirize society. And the final paragraph kind of elaborates on the trickster. It gives an example. It says, this combination of mythic setting and mortal weakness that determines the targets of the trickster's comic hijinks, the foibles of mortal beings, right? The eternal foibles of mortal beings. We're trying to make fun of the idiosyncrasies of humans, right? But not in a way that we are showing the hypocrisy of society, not in the way that we're sort of condemning society, but that we're just exemplifying what not to do. This is what you might sort of be tempted to act like, but you shouldn't act like as the reader of this work, right? And then they give an example. In one story, for example, a coyote trickster falls in love with a star, and in the end, the star takes the trickster up into the sky and lets the trickster fall back to Earth. The listeners sort of realize that the trickster got a comeuppance for reaching beyond proper limits, but all the while, they sort of identify with that extravagant hope, right? That's a human thing, to have that extravagant hope for something that's sort of beyond reach. So anyway, hopefully this all made sense. I think we maybe spent a little longer than we had to on this because the questions were very, very simple, as we're about to see, but basically just to understand the main ideas of each paragraph. Hopefully this was at least kind of interesting to learn about, but basically we're just contrasting the Picaro and the trickster. Even though they are superficially similar in terms of their function in their respective works, they serve different purposes. So let's go ahead and look at the questions. Number 8 is a pretty simple question. It's straight from the second paragraph. Number 8 says, society in these picaresque novels that we discussed in that paragraph perceive the Picaro as dangerous. Why? Why do they perceive the Picaro as dangerous? Well, it's straight from the middle of that paragraph, right? The Picaro's authenticity serves as a foil to the perceived hypocrisy of society, and therefore to such a society, the Picaro can be a dangerous, disruptive freedom, and society reacts by marginalizing him. Why? Because of what we just read about in the previous sentence, right? It serves as a foil to the perceived hypocrisy, right? It exposes the hypocrisy of society because it gives in to all these desires, vices, and follies with relish and freedom. The rest of society kind of shun the Picaro, but really they secretly indulge in all the same things. So it exposes the hypocrisy of society, as we discussed when we read that paragraph. But of course, that's a very simple answer we're looking for. Exposes the hypocrisy of society. Again, straight from that paragraph. Let's look for that in the answers. A, it never says anything about inflicting physical injury anywhere in that second paragraph, right? The danger was that it exposes the hypocrisy of society. Never says anything about physically, punching people in the face or anything like that. B, long-standing political structures are never really mentioned anywhere in this entire passage, certainly not in that second paragraph, right? It says why society sees the Picaro as a dangerous, disruptive freedom, because it's a foil to the perceived hypocrisy. It exposes the hypocrisy of society, not because it's upsetting long-standing political structures. There's no reference made to that anywhere. C is kind of mixing up the cause and the effect, right? Because we're looking for the reason for why they see the Picaro as dangerous, right? C says the Picaro has been marginalized by society. No, that's an effect of the fact that they see him as dangerous that caused them to marginalize him, according to this paragraph, right? According to this passage, it says they react by marginalizing him. They react to the fact that he's dangerous and disruptive by marginalizing him. So it's not the marginalization that is a cause, is a reason for them perceiving him as dangerous. It's the other way around, right? This question is asking, why do they perceive him as dangerous, right? So this doesn't make sense. It's backwards. D is perfect. It's exactly what we were looking for. It's the only thing we could have possibly predicted here because it's straight from the second paragraph, right? The second paragraph says, why does society see the Picaro as dangerous? Because the Picaro's authenticity serves as a foil to the hypocrisy of conventional society. It exposes their hypocrisy, right? And therefore, it's a dangerous and disruptive freedom, and they react by marginalizing him. So that's exactly what D is saying. The Picaro threatens to make society face its hypocrisy. That's why they see him as dangerous, and therefore this is the very simple, correct answer. E doesn't really make sense. It never mentions this in the passage, whether the Picaro suffers consequences for indulging in vices or not. It kind of sounds like the Picaro does, right? The Picaro, as a result of indulging, is marginalized by society. That's a pretty big consequence. So E is not true, right? It doesn't seem to be true, and it's certainly not the reason given. They gave us the reason for why society marginalizes, why society is afraid of this person. It was because he exposes their hypocrisy, not because of this, and therefore this is not the answer we were looking for. Number 9 is a very simple question. It says, based on the passage, applying trickster to the character of the Picaro is most analogous to which one of the following? That's what the critics do in the first paragraph. They apply trickster to Picaro. And the author's whole point in this passage is that even though those two things are superficially similar, they have some similarities, but applying trickster to Picaro is obscuring all the major differences between them, right? That fundamentally they're very different. So even though they seem similar, the author thinks that it's misguided, it's incorrect of these critics to just treat them the same, to just apply the trickster term to the Picaro, because they're fundamentally different, even though they're superficially similar. So based on everything we just said, based on everything we read from the passage, I think we're pretty equipped to look for something that's analogous to that. Basically taking two things that are not really the same, they look the same, so we treat them the same, even though they're not. That's what we're looking for. A doesn't make sense. It does not apply to this. Claiming that someone is extreme politically when they're actually centrist, right? We're exaggerating the extremity of something. That doesn't make any sense, because it's not like the trickster and the Picaro, one of them is more extreme and one of them is more centrist or moderate. And if we call a Picaro a trickster, we're really saying that someone who's centrist is actually extreme. That doesn't make any sense. That wasn't the comparison made between these two things, that one of them was centrist or moderate and the other one was extreme. So this has no place in our analysis of this passage. B is perfect, right? Because characterizing the panda as a bear based on the fact that they have some superficial similarities, even though fundamentally, if we understand it deeper, no, it's actually related to the raccoon. It's actually something else entirely. This is perfect, right? This is just like applying the term trickster to the Picaro, because there are superficial similarities between them, when a deeper understanding, which is one brought about by reading this analysis in this passage, shows that no, that really they're different things. They're not the same as each other. So this is perfect, exactly what we were looking for. C, I can't possibly see how this is relevant here. How is it like calling a court decision a milestone as a metaphor that it's significant? What does that have to do with anything? Why is applying the term trickster to Picaro a metaphor for something being very significant? I don't see how that applies here. D is perhaps the closest of all the wrong answers, but it's still wrong because it doesn't fit what we were looking for. D says classifying a species of pine as evergreen. So it is right in a sense that we are talking about classifying something the wrong way, but the reasoning isn't there. It says classifying a pine as evergreen, even though a lot of its needles turn brown and fall off. I don't know what that has to do with anything. Needles turning brown and falling off, how is that shown to be relevant? How can you possibly say that that's analogous to anything in our passage, right? We're looking for an answer that says classifying A as B because they superficially look similar, but then when you look at them deeper, you see that they're really not, that really they're different things, right? So D doesn't touch upon that whole dimension that we got from reading the passage, and certainly there's another answer that actually does, and that's the right answer. E, I can't see how this possibly applies here. Describing a weed as aggressive because it competes with flowers for sun and water. I mean, that makes sense, but what does that have to do with this passage, right? What does that have to do with applying the term trickster to Picaro, right? We're trying to look for an answer that says you are assuming that two things are similar because they look similar, but they're not really similar. I don't see any of that in E. E says calling a weed aggressive. I don't see the connection. Number 10, why did the author go to the trouble of mentioning that the flaws of the trickster are not a foil to a corrupt society? Why did the author have to say that? Well, what was the point being made in this paragraph that the trickster is not like the Picaro that we just said in the previous paragraph is a foil to a corrupt society, right? If you remember, that word was used in the previous paragraph. They were nice. They used the same word twice so that you can create a little more of a reference in your memory. Right in the second paragraph, it says that the Picaro's authenticity serves as a foil to a corrupt society. And then we said the opposite of that in the next paragraph to contrast these two figures. We said the trickster, however, the trickster is not a foil to a corrupt society. Instead, it's essential, all these flaws of the trickster are essential to who the trickster is. The trickster is who the trickster is. Not that they are making fun of society, they are a separate figure on their own. So we're contrasting the two. So why did the author say that they're not a foil to a corrupt society? To contrast them with the Picaro, who is a foil to a corrupt society, because that's the whole point of the passage, to contrast these two things, to show that they're not the same thing. So that is a pretty simple answer that we're looking for. Why did the author say this? To contrast it, to show that it's different from the Picaro. A doesn't really make any sense. What does not being a foil to a corrupt society have anything to do with being a comic figure with supernatural powers, right? The two things have nothing to do with each other, right? And yes, we did mention earlier on in the passage, at the very beginning, we did mention that the trickster is a comic figure with supernatural powers, but why would we be trying to prove or demonstrate that, right? That's not what we're trying to prove or demonstrate in this paragraph. We're trying to show that it's different from the Picaro. That's why we mention the question of whether it's a foil to a corrupt society or not. So it has nothing to do with it being supernatural and comic. B is backwards. We're not alluding to the functional similarities between these two characters, right? Just the opposite, right? Because the previous paragraph told us that the Picaro is a foil to a hypocritical society, right? And now we're saying in contrast to that, not in similarity to that, in contrast to that, the trickster is not a foil to a corrupt society, right? The deeds of the trickster are not a foil to a corrupt society. So this is pretty backwards. C is perfect. It's simple. It's exactly what we were looking for, right? As we mentioned when we introduced the question, we predicted this, right? The whole point was to show that there was this difference between the Picaro's function and the trickster's function. The Picaro serves as a foil to a hypocritical society, but in contrast with that, the trickster does not. And this was pretty simple because this was the whole point of the whole passage anyway. So this was a nice and easy question. C was correct. D is kind of backwards because the trickster isn't the one that is used to comment on society, right? It's the Picaro. The Picaro is the one that's used to make fun of, satirize, comment on the hypocrisy of society, right? The trickster has an instructional role. You're supposed to follow the negative example of the trickster so that you know what not to do, right? So it's not meant to engage in social commentary. This is kind of backwards. It's sort of what the Picaro is meant to do. E doesn't really make any sense. First of all, it's co-opting a word from the wrong place, right? The disruptive, anarchic character of the trickster. We said that the trickster was anarchic, and we said that the Picaro was disruptive. We never said that the trickster was disruptive. So first of all, it's kind of mixing things up a little bit. And second of all, why would the fact that it's not a foil to a corrupt society, what would that be doing to emphasize how disruptive it is? If anything, that shows that it's not disruptive, right? That's why the Picaro was disruptive, was because it was a foil to a corrupt society, right? So the fact that the trickster is not a foil to a corrupt society, why would that make it disruptive? If anything, it makes it pretty much not disruptive. So this doesn't make sense. Number 11, this is pretty much the same question that we've already had a couple times, right? This passage was nice to us because they basically keep asking us for the main point of the passage over and over again, right? The main point of the passage is that these critics in the first paragraph who assume that the trickster and the Picaro are the same thing are wrong, right? They're missing the fact that even though they have superficial similarities, they're fundamentally very different, as you can see when you investigate the significance of the trickster and the Picaro in their respective works. And that's the point of this passage, to show that no, these critics are wrong because they're very different. They're not the same, right? So what would the author think about the literary criticism mentioned in the first paragraph? That's question number 11. Well, just what we just said, and just what we've already said to a couple of the other questions that we've been asked so far, which is that they are wrong. They are assuming these two things are the same, but if they looked into the matter deeper, they would see that that's not the case. So let's look for something that very simply answers the question in roughly that way. A, there's certainly no evidence for this anywhere, right? Where on earth does it ever say that these critics have systematically denigrated the Native American tradition? Where does it say that anywhere? This isn't the kind of thing that you can sort of just guess, right? You need to find a source in the passage. The passage never said anything about systematic denigration of Native Americans. B is way too extreme, right? B says that the way the critics apply the trickster name to the Picaro has nothing to do with the Native American trickster character. That's not true. They do have some superficial similarities, right? The author admits that in this paragraph, right? Both of them are heroes of episodic adventures. They both live on the peripheries, yada, 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 right? So they do have some similarities. The point is that even though they have some superficial similarities, they're fundamentally different and they shouldn't be called the same thing. But you can't go so far as to say that it has nothing to do with the Native American trickster character. So that doesn't make sense. C, I'm not even really sure what this means. How can you say that the criticism is reading picaresque novels in a way that's at odds, that contradicts with the way that it reads Native American trickster stories? First of all, what does that mean? How can the way that you read one book be at odds with the way that you read another book, right? And where does that come from in the passage, right? We're not saying that the way that they read these two books contradicts with each other, right? That it's different. If anything, we're saying the opposite. We're saying that they blend them together. They assume they're the same, but they should be seeing them as different. So this doesn't really make sense. I can't quite figure out what it means, and it's going in the wrong direction anyway, right? We want to say that they think it's the same, but it's really different, right? So that doesn't really make sense. D, it never says this anywhere, right? This isn't the kind of thing that you can just guess. You need a source, right? There's no source in the passage that says that these critics were attempting to be precise in their terminology. It never says that, right? It just says they use the term trickster to refer to something else, but they're obscuring the differences between those two things. But who knows? Maybe they weren't attempting to be precise, right? Maybe they were using it in an imprecise way. We never speak to that either way, so therefore there's no evidence for this. E is exactly right, and it's pretty much the main point of the whole passage, right? These critics, their analysis is based on an incomplete understanding of trickster stories, right? They are looking at the superficial similarities, but if only they looked deeper into trickster stories, if only they knew all the stuff that we are spelling out in the paragraphs to follow in this passage, if only they had a complete understanding of trickster stories and they were able to see that tricksters are actually different from picaros, then they would realize that fundamentally these two things are different, right? So it's an incomplete understanding. It's just on the surface. Superficially, yes, they look the same, these two characters, but if they really had a deeper, more complete, fundamental understanding of trickster stories, they would see that no, the trickster actually functions in a different role than the picaro. So this is exactly what we were looking for and is correct. Number 12, what did we mean by authenticity in the second paragraph? Well, this is a pretty micro, small picture, not a big picture question. Let's just look to that sentence and the immediately preceding sentence. Let's get the context so we know what's being talked about here in case we can't remember it. Let's go back and jog our memories. So it says in the preceding sentence that the picaro indulges in vices and follies, right? Gives in to his desires with relish and freedom, and that upsets the rest of society, even though they secretly indulge in those same things. So thus, the picaro's authenticity, the fact that the picaro is doing this, is giving in openly to his vices and follies. He's being authentic. He's giving in to these desires as opposed to the rest of society, which is sort of hypocritically pretending not to have those desires. The picaro is authentic. The picaro is authentic about who he is and his desires and giving into all those vices and desires, right? So that authenticity therefore serves as a foil to expose the hypocrisy of the rest of society. They're not sort of authentic, right? They're sort of hypocrites, right? They're pretending like they don't indulge in those things even though they really do. So the picaro is giving into his vices and doing so authentically, and that's the authenticity that's mentioned in these two sentences. That's what we're talking about. So let's look for that in the answer choices, right? Giving into his vices, that is the authenticity being referred to. A might be the meaning of authentic in some other context, but it doesn't make sense in this context, right? Conforming to what original, right? It's not as if the picaro is a replica of something else and it's conforming, it's authentically conforming to that thing that it's a copy of, right? That doesn't make any sense in the context of this passage. B, I don't see the connection. What does authenticity here have to do with having some essential features? What essential features, right? The authenticity we're talking about is the fact that it gives into its vices and follies. So that has nothing to do with what B is saying. I don't know what essential features it's referring to or it could possibly be referring to. C is backwards. It's just the opposite. It's not behaving as others do, right? The authenticity of the picaro, the fact that it's indulging with relish and freedom, right? That's not what the other members of society are doing, right? And that's why they hate this guy, because they secretly indulge in these things, but they don't do it publicly. They don't give in to all these things publicly, which is what the picaro does. So no, it's just the opposite. He doesn't behave like they do. He behaves differently. That's why he's a threat to them. The fact that he does all this stuff out in the open, whereas they do it in secret. D doesn't make sense. Absolute trust, what does that have to do with anything here, right? It's not like we're talking about trusting this picaro, right? The authenticity is not that we can trust the picaro. The authenticity, as we said in this paragraph, is that he gives in to his desires. That has nothing to do with inspiring trust. E is very simple. It's exactly what we were looking for, and it's the only thing we could have possibly predicted, right? Because it's the only thing that authenticity meant in this context, right? The fact that the picaro follows his own natural desires, gave in to his vices and follies. That's what we're talking about. That authenticity serves as a foil to expose the hypocrisy of the rest of society, right? We don't have to guess this. It's in that paragraph. It's in the immediately preceding sentence, and it's what's being referred to by this word authenticity, and therefore this is clearly correct. Number 13, final question. Which of the following is not a reason that the author refers to this story in the last paragraph about the coyote, trickster, and the star? This is the first question we're getting about this coyote, trickster, and star kind of odd story. So 4 of these answers are going to be reasons that the author mentioned it, and one of them is not. So rather than try to predict the answer, let's just go through the answers and show that for the 4 wrong answers, they are made reference to in that paragraph, and then there's one that doesn't really make any sense. So let's take a look. A, how on earth does it show evidence why coyotes make particularly good trickster characters, right? This story does not ever make any use of the fact that it's a coyote, right? This could have been anything. It could have been a monkey. It could have been a zebra, right? So how on earth the fact that it falls in love with a star and then gets dropped back to earth and then it learns its lesson that it had these extravagant desires that ended up hurting it, right? That would happen to an elephant just as much as it would happen to a coyote. I mean, I don't know. What does this have to do with it being a coyote? So therefore, A doesn't make sense. A is the correct answer, right? How is this a reason? How is this something that the author was showing, right? The fact that it was a coyote never played in. Why would we be trying to demonstrate this? Why would we be trying to give evidence for why coyotes make the best trickster characters? Why would that be a point that the author even wants to make in the first place? So that's not the point being made in this paragraph. We're more just demonstrating the kind of purpose, the literary purpose that the trickster serves, right? But why would we be trying to show that one animal is better than another animal? It doesn't really make sense. So anyway, this is the correct answer. B, yes, this is one of the wrong answers. It does illustrate the claim that the targets of trickster stories are human flaws, right? It does say that, human foibles. It even uses that word foibles, right? It says in the first sentence of that last paragraph that the particular targets of the trickster's hijinks are the foibles of mortal beings. How so? Well, in one story, for example, So that is clearly illustrating this point. So B is therefore one of the wrong answers because this is an accept question. C, yes, it does show that the tricksters are comic figures, and that's why it's one of the wrong answers because this is an accept question, right? We're looking for the wrong answer. This paragraph does show that it's comic, right? It says in the first sentence that we have the trickster's comic hijinks. Comic hijinks. What's an example of a trickster's comic hijink? Well, for example, a coyote trickster fell in love with a star. That's pretty comical, right? It's so comical that it doesn't make any sense. But that is definitely an example that shows, right? It's kind of a funny, comical story. And it's an example of the trickster's comic hijink, as it's said in this paragraph. And therefore, that is definitely accurate. So it's one of the wrong answers. D is very much accurate, and that's why it's not the right answer, right? We're looking for the one that is not a purpose of the author's example, right? It's an accept question. And D, yes, it does illustrate this. It does illustrate how human listeners can identify with the trickster, right? And there's very explicit evidence for this in the final sentence, right? It says that the story's listeners, they realize that the trickster has kind of reached beyond proper limits, but at the same time, they recognize in themselves the trickster's extravagant desires. They identify with the trickster in that way, and therefore this comes straight from the passage and therefore is the wrong answer. E is correct, and that's why it's one of the wrong answers because this is an accept question, right? E says it indicates that one human trait tricksters have is extravagant desire. Yes, it says that very explicitly in the last sentence, right? It says that the story's listeners, right, they see that the trickster has kind of reached beyond proper limits, but all the while they identify with that. They recognize in themselves those same extravagant desires, extravagant hopes. And so E is very much supported by the final sentence, and therefore it is one of the wrong answers. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.